in a society where possessiveness at all is a foreign concept, the idea of possessing another person becomes very kind of problematic. This is an example, I think a prime example, of where we take our personal experience and assume it's universally human.
Yeah.
And what we found in Sex at Dawn is it isn't at all. There might be an impulse towards some sort of, I don't want anyone else to have what I have, just as there may be an impulse to eat all the food if you're hungry and ignore the fact that everyone else is hungry too. But there are mechanisms to discourage this. So one of them, I was told about this by an anthropologist who lived with this group. It's a tribe in the Amazon basin. He said it's called the call for meat. So in the morning, the women get up and the men haven't been hunting for a while and there's no meat and they're tired of eating tubers and berries and fish or whatever. And so the women, they get a stick and they go around and they're singing this song. And the song basically is, we want meat, you men are lazy, you should get up and we want meat. And a woman who is not currently having sex with this man will bang on the post of his hammock with her stick. And what that means is, if you come back with meat, I'll sleep with you tonight. And so they'll go around and different women will bang on different men's, posts. and this anthropologist, it was really, his description was hilarious because it's all like, then the men will feign, I don't really feel like it, but I don't know. And then the men will leave the village. And then the men plan to meet up outside of the village at the end of the day because they hunt, they disperse, right? Mm-hmm. So they go out and they hunt, and it's mostly monkeys. And a couple of guys will get a monkey and most of them won't. And then they come back and they meet outside the village and they cut up the monkeys. And then they walk into the village so that every man has a piece of monkey when he goes, they go into the village. Mm-hmm. So everybody's going to get laid that night, right? And I said to this anthropologist, the call to get meat, is there a double entendre there, with meat?
Right.
And he said, oh yeah, there's definitely a double entendre. It's a big party and everybody's laughing and having a great time and, So there are rituals to sort of encourage people not to get too possessive and exclusive about sexuality.
Welcome to Human Nature Odyssey, a podcast exploring human nature, what's part of culture and what's universal. I'm Alex Leff. Hey, today, author Christopher Ryan joins us on our Odyssey. Christopher Ryan is the New York Times best-selling author of Sex at Dawn, How We Mate, Why We Stray, and What It Means for Modern Relationships, as well as the book Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. He's also the host of the podcast Tangentially Speaking, which has been downloaded over 30 million times. Shout out to Maren Morgan from the Death in the Garden podcast, who recommended I read Civilized to Death earlier this year. I did, and found it absolutely fascinating. You ever read a book and are like, how have I not read this book before? How did it take me so long to find it? The first season of Human Nature Odyssey was based on the novel Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, which questions what it really means to be human, what's our role on this planet, if it's not to conquer and master it, and build some crazy-ass civilization. Well, Civilized to Death is essentially the nonfiction version of Ishmael. It explores similar ideas, but connects the dots to the anthropological evidence, research, and studies that invite us to question a lot of our assumptions about how supposedly advanced our civilization is and what other ways of life might be better suited for us. So I'm very excited to share this conversation with you. It's a wonderful thing meeting more fellow travelers, exploring the ideas and questions of humans and nature and civilization. I got to meet even more fellow travelers recently. Last month, we had the first ever Human Nature Odyssey live discussion with folks who are supporting the podcast on Patreon. And it was so cool getting to meet some of the folks who've been listening all along and hear their thoughts, realizing this is a real community we're building here, and it's only just the beginning. We'll have more live conversations like that one too in the future. So if you'd like to be a part of it, check out the Human Nature Odyssey Patreon. It is quite the challenge balancing working on something like this with the need to survive and make a living. So thank you, everyone who's supporting Human Nature Odyssey on Patreon. It really does make a difference. And there's plenty other ways to support the podcast too. If you haven't yet, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, leave a comment, give us a positive rating and review. That stuff also really helps win the favor of the algorithm gods so more people can find us. And finally, this month, we're starting something really exciting. Have you been thinking to yourself, like, I like this podcast, but one episode a month? What's this guy doing? I gotta wait a whole month for more stuff to listen to? Well, okay, don't worry. Got you covered. Marin and Jake from Death in the Garden podcast and I will be recording monthly bonus episodes in addition to our regular episodes that will release on Patreon. We've recorded our first couple already, and it was so much fun talking with those guys. The first bonus episode we'll release soon is a conversation on AI, what intelligence really is, and how to navigate this ridiculous new era society has flung itself into for some reason. The second conversation we recorded is on the mythology of Star Wars, specifically the new spin-off series Andor, and what it teaches us about empire and rebellion. These conversations will only be available in full on our Patreon to help support us working on all this stuff for hopefully many more years to come. So check out the Patreon, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you'll hear more about these new episodes soon. All right. And without any further ado, here is the conversation with author Christopher Ryan. Well, I'm really excited to be talking with you today, Chris.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Good to be here.
I just finished reading your book from 2019, Civilized to Death. The path that I am trying to navigate on Human Nature Odyssey, a lot of it felt like going through the weeds, trying to find this trail, and you're kind of bushwhacking and trying to connect different dots. And reading Civilized to Death kind of felt like all of a sudden making it out to a clearing and being like, oh, okay, there was a trail running parallel to mine the whole time. I could have just been walking on that. So excited to compare notes from our different journeys.
From our bushwhacking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one way I was thinking we could start this, you kind of frame the journey of Civilized to Death in a somewhat similar, without using the language, using the metaphor of an odyssey, leaving home and finding our way back to it. So in this conversation, if we're going to go on an odyssey, every journey begins at home. I'm curious, what was home for you? Not necessarily your childhood home or your parents' house, although those could be true. I'm curious about the closest thing to being what felt like a homeland when you were growing up. Like for me, I've talked about on the podcast that being this abandoned country club down the street from me. And that was where I felt the most free. I could explore. I didn't have to follow the rules of school or my parents. And it felt like I belonged to something wild, but I was home in it. I could pick berries and experiment with eating them. I could camp out there overnight, and I felt like that was the closest thing I experienced as a kid to having a homeland. And I'm curious, what was that for you, if you have something?
I would say for me, it was probably in the realm of imagination rather than a physical place.
Mm.
My family moved fairly often when I was a kid. So I was like constantly in a different place with different people. And I didn't feel particularly at home in any of those places. But what happened for me was around the age of 9 or 10, maybe, I got fascinated with Native American cultures. And like I was all in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean any disrespect to anyone, but like if someone can feel that they were born in the wrong body as far as gender goes, I felt I was born in the wrong body and time, maybe not place, because I really related to the native people of the Northeast, because I was a kid in those particular forests. And so I built a wigwam in the backyard. And this is like suburban Pittsburgh. I, had rabbit pelts stretched out, drying in the sun. And I would come home from school and immediately take off all my Western clothes and contemporary clothes and put on a loincloth. And I would like hang out in my loincloth until morning when I had to go to school again. And I'd reluctantly, pretend to be a white kid in Western PA in the 1970s. But I really felt that I was I just felt like that made sense to me, what I was reading. And I just read vociferously and voraciously, I guess is the word, everything I could find about Native American cultures. And I think, that's why what fueled it was a sense, this weird kind of familiarity. And I know that there's a lot of romanticization of those cultures. And of course, in those days, this is like early. So I was born in 1962. So I was 10 in the early 1970s. So there was kind of, in those days, there was a sort of emergence of the sort of hippie movement, the countercultural movement,
Right,
ecological, the first Earth Day, the first kind of awareness of litter and the destruction of the environment and overpopulation, and all these things were in the zeitgeist
right.
that I was picking up. And, it was common for, hippies to wear buckskin jackets and moccasins and, pretty girls with feathers in their hair and all that kind of stuff. So, I'm sure I was sort of influenced by the cultural currents that were running at the time. But I went deeper than that. I was very interested in getting as much knowledge as I could about the way those people lived and interacted with each other. And the Odyssey that you're talking about, it's an interesting way to think about it, because when I was writing Civilized to Death, I felt in many ways like I was closing a circle. I felt like I owed it somehow to tell that story, because I feel like the story's been mistold so many times.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I owed it to my childhood passions to tell that story.
I can certainly relate to being a kid and not feeling like, I think for me it was like, I don't know if I'm in the right culture. This culture doesn't seem aligned with who I am and what I need. And I don't necessarily think the other people around me are that happy with it either. And I imagine it's common for folks that feel that way, especially growing up in the States, but in many places where there was a relatively recent, indigenous population that was replaced to some extent. And there's this bizarre ghost of another people and another culture that used to be here, but isn't as prevalent anymore.
Yeah, and within ourselves, right? I think we have some kind of genetic memory of living as hunter-gatherers. And so all of us probably grow up looking around saying, what the hell is this? This isn't what my spirit, my being was expecting, you know?
Right, right. And I think maybe that's a good thing to distinguish between culture and lifestyle, although of course the distinction's somewhat blurry, but talking about like wearing the clothes of Native Americans, and especially like in the 60s and 70s when so many kids raised in a Western environment began to identify with that. There's certainly like a surface level to that, and that's been criticized as appropriation because now we can just kind of sell these cool looking things at a store. But like you're saying, you were interested in something deeper as well, not just the kind of cultural artifacts, but a way of life, a way of seeing the world. And as opposed to being appropriation, I think like when you recognize you're in an unhealthy culture and you see other cultures that are behaving a way, viewing the world and themselves a way that seems way more aligned with what makes sense to you, it's like, seems healthy to me to be able to try to have an exchange of ideas that use that as an inspiration. And there's certainly a legacy of that. Europeans, when they first came to the Americas, were convinced that hierarchy and top-down authoritarian rule was the most natural thing in the world, and were very confused to find these societies in North America that were living these more egalitarian ways. And I certainly find it compelling to think that that sort of exchange, even though it was often violent and clashing, that it led to lots of thinkers rethinking the idea of hierarchy and led to ideas of egalitarianism and liberty that influenced the European Enlightenment. And so there's a legacy, it seems, of people from what we call Western cultures being deeply influenced and inspired by these other cultures that have been living so differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's reflected in the Bill of Rights and the American Constitution, right? Like Benjamin Franklin was familiar with the tricameral governmental system of the Iroquois Nation, in which there needed to be agreement between the warriors and the elders, and then the final agreement was the Council of Women before they could go to war or do anything that affected everyone. So there was like a checks and balances system, and the Iroquois Nation was a federation. They were separate tribes that had their own, I think they shared a common language for the most part, but they had different, some were on the sea and some were lakes and some were forests, and they had different land and different customs, but they came together for big decisions that affected all of them. And, here we are in the United States, a federalist system with, supposedly checks and balances and supposedly representative, one person, one vote kind of. We may be at the end of that era, even as we speak, but at least that's the way it's been for, a couple hundred years.
That's been the ideal we've been paying lip service to and striving to, at least. I'm curious, too, so on Human Nature Odyssey, we're exploring human nature. It's in the name. Shouldn't be too surprising. Seems to be a key thing in your bushwhacking as well. And so I wanted to ask you, because I think that this question of, as you phrase it, like knowing thy species, knowing ourselves as a species, like who are we? Knowing that we can change culture. You as a kid, you were like, okay, people in one culture go to grocery stores and behave this one way, or people have these federated tribes and behave a very different way. So then who are we as a species if we can behave so varied? What first drew you to that question and kind of putting it in those human nature terms?
I guess the way I articulated it to myself was that I wanted to disentangle what I saw as three essential levels of human behavior or consciousness, which is what is universally human. Mm-hmm. So what are the things that we all think, feel, fear, experience as humans? And then what is cultural, right? So what is it that French people experience that Italians don't, and vice versa? and which probably comes down to language in many cases and how experiences are filtered through language. And then what's personal, right? What's specific to your perception of the world that I can't understand, and what's specific to mine. So that was what I was really interested in trying to disentangle. For example, sexuality is, to what extent is our sexual experience species level experience, or even beyond that, just mammalian, which I got into when I was writing Sex at Dawn, versus cultural versus personal, right? So, on a deep level, I think that what a lot of people do is they take their personal experience of something and they say it's human, right? Like, I feel jealous when my partner looks at another man. Therefore, jealousy is an innate human reaction to mate guarding behavior that evolved in the Pleistocene and blah, 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 blah. And there's a lot of that in evolutionary theory, where you take something that you happen to experience and you project it onto the species.
Something that really, as I talk about in the whole first season of Human Nature Odyssey, became obsessed with Ishmael when I was 14, Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And I think before then, like you, I also felt like my culture was ill-fitting clothes. And I was also, I wonder if this is a little bit different too, because I was born a little later, so things were a little more obviously dire on a planetary level. I was learning that, I remember learning about the concept of an iceberg in the same instant I was learning that, and they're melting.
Right.
And that was pretty upsetting. And
yeah,
so then I think for so many people, you kind of develop the sense of like, what is wrong with us? And by us, we mean all of humanity. It seems like civilization. Well, I'll say that I think what I got from Ishmael is distinguishing between civilization and humanity beyond that. And because civilization has now encompassed so much of the world, very few of us ever interact directly with someone outside of it. So it seems to be that even though we have all these different countries, there's folks in Mexico, there's folks in Japan, there's folks in Iran, they speak these different languages, but we are all part of this civilizational culture as distinguished from foraging cultures, which I want to get into with you. It's hard to imagine that a way of being, since everyone in Mexico and Japan and Iran have these commonalities, we just assume that those commonalities are what all of humanity would share. It's kind of like, if you never left your small town, you'd have a hard time believing or even imagining that someone could speak in another accent. That my accent is not even the one way to voice my language. And so, it seems like a key part of your thinking was also trying to figure out what is part of civilization's culture and how is that different? How did that change from the kind of nature that we evolved to have as humans? Because I think also you make a point that's really interesting. On one hand, someone could say, okay, so clearly people are different in hunter-gatherer communities, people are different in civilizations. People can be all sorts of different ways. Human nature is just varied. And I hear you making the point that it's varied to a certain extent. Like we can adapt to many different ways, but we did evolve for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years as a certain way. And that because of that evolution, that way of being, even though we have put on these different cultural clothes since, deep within us, there's a yearning for living in a culture that's more aligned to this kind of way of being that humans evolved with. How would you better articulate that?
Yeah, it's complicated because I feel like it's a multi-dimensional concept, because I feel like it's quite obvious that we have a trajectory. Like I was saying before, like kids grow up and they're like, wait a minute, this isn't what I was expecting, right? There's a book called The Continuum Concept, which I talked about in Civilized to Death. It's a beautiful book. she describes these things as expectations. So our lungs expect clean air, right? Our liver expects certain nutrients. Our digestive system expects a certain amount of fiber, and these expectations come from our evolutionary past. And when we defy those expectations, we end up with cancer and other metabolic diseases and high blood pressure and stress and, all the rest of it, and depression and anxiety. Because we also have those expectations in our psychology. We expect a certain level of stress, but not more than that. And we expect acute stress, not chronic stress, as Robert Sapolsky writes about. I do think that there is a sort of overall trajectory of Homo sapiens as a species, and there are particular environments in which we will thrive, socially, sexually, physically, in terms of our bodily health. But on the other hand, there are some books now. There's a book called The History of Everything or something.
The Dawn of Everything?
Is that
what
David
I'm thinking of? Yeah, the two Davids.
Yes. David Graeber and the other David.
David Wengrow. Yeah.
Wengrow, exactly right. I disagree with the thesis of that book, which is that, we chose the culture we're living in, therefore we can choose another one. So I feel like there's this sort of predestination in some ways, and I'm not articulating this better than you did, by the way. Because
if we combine them together, there's some sense coming out of it.
Yeah, it's confusing to try to put them together because I feel like, I don't know if you've read Marvin Harris, the anthropologist. He wrote a book called Cannibals and Kings that was a popular anthropology book. It's really good. But he develops a thesis that he calls cultural materialism.
That's why I recognize that name. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Basically, the idea is that cultures are a response to a given environment. So there are certain kinds of cultures that grow out of a desert environment, and different kinds of cultures would grow out of a jungle environment or an Arctic environment. The characteristics of the culture are largely a response to the demands of the particular ecosystem in which the culture emerges. And that makes a lot of sense to me. His arguments are very strong and the examples are fantastic. And so I kind of feel like we can make changes around the edges, but I don't feel that we can just change culture based on our will. And I feel like that's a mistake. And, I struggle with it because I don't want to discourage people from going out and protesting and, making their voice heard and so on and so forth. But I kind of feel like in some ways that might be a waste of effort in some cases. And it makes more sense to invest that effort into changing your immediate surroundings rather than trying to change the course of history.
Right. Well, I always feel like the end of any good conversation is just saying, well, it's about balance, right? But it's often kind of true. And because it seems like it goes both ways a little bit too. Or maybe, changing culture is about kayaking down a turbulent river. Like, you can't really change the river, but depending on how you steer it, there are different pathways you can take. There's different eddies you can go down. There's different rapids you can avoid.
That's a good way of looking at it. And I think people who are trying to change the river are ignoring their paddle, the paddle that's in their hands. So I agree with you. I think going down a river is a really good way to look at it. Pay attention to the things you can control, which is your kayak,
Exactly. And that's the bizarre thing about culture that, if there's kind of these three levels of like, there's the natural world, there's society, and then there's the individual. The individual clearly can change the natural world. I mean, we're doing it. But there's a certain extent that we can't change about the natural world. We can't change the law of gravity. Even though we fly in airplanes, when we're sitting on our chair, we're still accustomed to the same law of gravity. But we can build dams and change the way rivers flow, not to confuse my previous metaphor. But similarly, culture is a collectively emerging being phenomenon. And it seems like we probably have a little bit more say over that than nature, but still it's because it's an emergent phenomenon of so many different inputs that are changing it. Just because one fish swims in the opposite direction, it's not going to change the direction of the whole school of fish. But because I hear what you're saying, that we can't change culture with our sheer will, but even reading your book, it sounds like there's more a sense of, the whole reason I imagine you're making the argument of trying to change people's expectations of who we are as a species and what we need to thrive. Hypothetically, if we could ideally sit everyone down and have them have a big book club, global book club together, I imagine that our culture would change significantly than if we hadn't done that. And I think, like you're saying, like environment is a key factor. Like a certain culture evolves in the desert, but it seems like there's others as well, too, other inputs that would shift the way a culture flows.
Sure. Economic, I think, is a major one. I also feel like you said we can change nature as an individual. We're doing it. But that conflates individual human with individual species.
Right. Okay, well, so by changing nature, like I can go out and chop a tree right now.
Yeah, but
I'm in no shape to do that.
But that's going to have an insignificant effect on the natural world. Right? Until you get to a species level, and then... Yeah, anyway, I don't know if this is part of the same thing, but I think of humanity as a superorganism, and like you brought up the image of the fish. It's really interesting how salmon go out into the ocean and swim individually for 4 or 7 years, depending on the species. And then when they go back toward the rivers or streams where they were born, they reach a certain density and it becomes a school, and they start moving as one unit. Flocks of birds are the same, and different species, even cattle do this. And so then it becomes like, well, if we're a superorganism, then how do we even change the direction of the flock? Like nobody's in charge. Nobody's saying, now we're going to all fly over here. It just happens. And so I feel like there are these emergent intelligences that, we're speaking on a very large scale here, right, of cultural change and all that. I feel like AI is the one that's emerging at the moment, and God knows where that's going to take us, right? Because now it becomes, I think we've already had superorganisms like corporations and governments that don't have, their agendas are not convergent with the human agenda. So what's good for the corporation is not good for the shareholders or the customers or the people who work there, but it doesn't matter. The corporate interest takes over,
And they've transcended what any one individual can do. I think I agree with what you're saying about the limits of an individual in shaping the superorganism. I think we have this kind of like authoritarian model of how society is shaped. And I think people who criticize authoritarian leaders as like the sole thing to blame about, like authoritarian phenomenons, as well as people who support authoritarian leaders is like, this is the person can save us. Both are a little misguided. I think that like someone like Jeff Bezos, for example, like he could be replaced tomorrow. Donald Trump could be replaced tomorrow. These people are riding a surfboard on a wave, but they're certainly not the wave themselves. And so these superorganisms that you're talking about are like, what's so bizarre about these corporations or these market systems or something like AI, it's that no one person is really in control of these things, which is bizarre because they emerged from us.
Yeah. Yeah, but they emerge from us the way music emerges from us, right? But nobody's in charge of music. No one's deciding what music is going to be created or appreciated. Yeah, there's something larger than human agency going on, I think.
Mm.
So, in light of that, I think of this, I think it's an Indian story or something about the fleas on the elephant's back trying to decide which direction to make the elephant go. Like when people are like, well, what should we do? Or all respect to Margaret Mead, but that I'm so sick of that quote of, never doubt that a small group of passionate people can change the course of history. In fact, it's the only thing that has. I'm paraphrasing, but pretty closely.
No, that was pretty good. That sounded right.
I don't think that's true. I think, as you said, people ride a wave. And watching surfers, and you see there are a whole bunch of surfers floating around out there, bobbing and bobbing. And then one guy catches a wave and it curls and it's beautiful. A little kid might look at that and say, oh, he made that happen. Look, that guy, he got up on his surfboard and made that wave happen. But we understand, no, he just happened to be in the right place and paddled into it at the right speed. And, he caught the wave. He didn't create the wave. And I feel like that's what happens. We look at Martin Luther King and say he changed the world. Well, did he? Or was the world changing and he happened to articulate things in a way that created a convergence, but someone else could have done the same thing, right? It could have been Jesse Jackson. If Martin Luther King weren't giving the speeches, maybe Jesse Jackson would have been. Or Gandhi, or you look at these revolutionaries, Hitler, he's a, one of a kind evil person, but fascism was happening. Germany was a cauldron of anger and resentment and despair. After the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, something bad was going to happen, and it happened to be Hitler.
Or something beautiful. I mean, I think that, and you talk about this in the book, that these like disasters are these opportunities for when people have very generous tendencies when things go wrong, but also in a state of panic, they can be coerced into having their fear manipulated to focus on in-groups and out-groups.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Well, one thing I want to ask you, this is kind of like backpedaling a little bit and getting out onto the main course, but maybe we'll see other ways they converge. Because I think this is a really fascinating part of your book, Civilized to Death. So there's this idea that, human cultures can differ wildly. And it's as if we're born a blank slate, and then our culture is the chalk that writes on that slate. But I hear you making a point that the slate actually has a shape to itself, and it's shaped through our hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. So therefore, some things work better for us than others, like the toilet. And so could you explain how...
Like the toilet, did you just say?
Like the toilet. This is your example.
Okay.
We're not supposed to sit on the toilet while we shit.
Right.
And that you use it as a metaphor for how civilization is not designed for our bodies. So first, I guess, could I ask you to define civilization just for the purpose of this conversation and the ways in which we have an inherent nature as human beings and how civilization is actually ill-fitting clothes to that inherent nature as human beings?
Okay, those are big questions. I would say civilization, as I see it in the book, is when a society reaches a scale on which first of all, there is a hierarchical leadership structure, which always emerges with large-scale societies. And the people who are at the upper reaches of the society don't know the people at the lower reaches. So it operates as an abstraction. So it's not a tribal society or a village society where, there may be a hierarchical leadership structure, but everyone knows each other. So there's reputational damage to think about. There's a sense of human compassion that engages because the people who are being affected by your decisions. Civilization is when it gets larger than that, and it becomes in reference to our previous conversation, it becomes a superorganism. It has its own interests and its own trajectory, and the leaders are replaced, but the civilization continues, right?
Yeah, yeah.
As far as the agenda of the civilization is to grow and to survive, it will trample the interests of the members of the civilization. They're not even members, they're victims often of the civilization in order to grow. And it's not about quality of life. It's not about equal rights. It's not about anything having to do with a good life for the individuals affected by it. It's got its own agenda, like a corporation, as we were saying. And so I look at human life now and I see that we live in a zoo that we have designed. Mm. And it's not a well-designed zoo. And I accept the notion that we have to live in an artificial environment at this point. Mm. There are too many people. The natural environment is too degraded. There's no way we're all just going to go live in the woods and, eat berries and bunnies. So we have to live in a controlled, domesticated kind of environment. But, like you can grow food using lots of pesticides that are known carcinogens, or you can grow food organically. There are ways to live on a large scale like this that aren't so sort of obviously counter to human well-being. So we could design the zoo better. And the way we design the zoo better is to understand the animal that's going to live inside it, right? So that's why I say know thy species. Understand what kind of animal Homo sapiens is. And that was something I was trying to do in both books, Sex at Dawn and Civilized to Death, to really set aside the cultural preoccupations and the taboos and the sensitivities and all these things that make us lie to ourselves about the reality of what we are. Let's just look at the evidence. What works? Where are people happy? Where is depression and suicide and anxiety at the lowest levels? And what do those societies have in common, right? So I do think there are objective scientific ways to explore these things. And that's what I tried to do in the book. And it's frustrating because you keep running up against these arguments that seem to make so much sense, going back to Thomas Hobbes all the way up to Steven Pinker. They're the same arguments where basically they're saying the way we live is great. Now argue back from that, right? That's not a rational way to look at these issues, right? That's bias. It's bias in terms of economics, in terms of historical moment. Like the idea of perpetual progress, if you really look into it, it means that this is always the best time to be alive now, right? Because things are always getting better.
Right.
Like, that doesn't make sense. The weather isn't always getting better, right? The sun isn't always getting brighter. Things are cyclical. Things go up and down, right? Your health isn't always getting better. Nothing's always getting better. It's just a nonsense notion. And yet it seems so commonsensical. It's very hard to argue against.
Well, we often talk about how our kids always do better than the parents. But then I think okay, well then how shitty of a parents were Adam and Eve? Because if we've just been getting better at our parents, it's like, man, that bar had to be very, very low. So it seems like at some point kids are actually doing worse than their parents, or maybe the whole concept of is something better or worse, not necessarily the most effective way to talk about it. Yeah, you have this quote in the book that says, if character is destiny, the best way to predict the proper destiny of Homo sapiens is to understand the true character of our species. What kind of creature are we anyway? And, I think that for a lot of people, the answer is, well, we're inherently selfish, and this can be either voiced religiously or it can be voiced completely secularly, that, either we are sinners, we're inherently sinners. Our nature is, there's a savageness to our nature. We're brutal. We just care about ourselves. Or just from a secular point of view, it's like we are, as Richard Dawkins articulated, so we have the selfish gene. That's what it means to be alive. We're in this fight with everything else, and those who survive are the most brutal, care about themselves only, and that civilization has created this taming process that's allowed people to be more moral and generous and civilized. And this is a narrative that you dispute throughout the whole book. You connect the dots between studies to try to not just make a philosophical argument about human nature, but that we've actually been researching human nature across cultures and the findings from that refute the idea that we're inherently selfish or sinners. I'm curious about how you kind of debunked that for yourself and how you went about researching it and what was some of the most interesting things you found.
Wow, how did I debunk it for myself? I think I'd grown up kind of embittered and distrusting of people because of what we talked about earlier, this sense of like, I'm in the wrong world, I'm in the wrong time. And my parents were great people. I didn't have any bitterness toward them, but just this sort of like distrusting, I think. So yeah, after that, I just went out into the world and traveled all over Latin America and Asia and all over the place. And that gave me the sense that, man, most people are really just good people. And especially the lower you go, like the closer to the ground you get, the kinder they are and the more generous they are. The less they have, the more generous they are. I remember I lived in Manhattan for a couple of years, and I remember talking to a homeless guy about that. I said, how come you don't like go down and hang out around Wall Street where all the rich people are, right? Like, wouldn't that be a good place? He's like, no, dude, rich people don't give you anything. It's the people who can imagine being here who will help you out, right?
Yeah, you make really interesting points about that in the book by showing the studies that people have done on this, that it's not necessarily about the greed that comes with a certain amount of wealth, but if you feel like the wealth inequality is just if the amount of wealth you have is so disparate from the person you're interacting with, then giving something to them feels like a drop in a bucket. Whereas people found that in these studies that those who are closer aligned, you can see yourself in that person and you think that the amount you're going to give them is going to make more of a difference. And so we didn't evolve in these hierarchical civilization systems. We evolved in these more egalitarian forager societies. And I want to kind of talk about how we define that, because obviously, whereas within our global civilization now, there's a lot of communication and there's this kind of trend towards a monoculture to a certain extent, the more we interact. Whereas forager societies are all over the world. Their religions, their languages, their clothes are so vastly different. And yet you talk about some of the universalities between these forager tribes, that there is a relatively high degree of egalitarianism, mobility, and gratitude in terms of how they view themselves in relation to the natural world. And I wanted to talk about specifically egalitarianism. You say it's not a coincidence that these foragers have more equal societies, but it actually the equality arises from the foraging itself. How does that work?
Right. Well, it goes back to our discussion of Marvin Harris earlier in cultural materialism, right? When you have societies that are organized around immediate return foraging, meaning there's no stored food. The food that you eat is the food that you found today or yesterday. So when there's no stored value, You don't get hierarchical situations because everyone has access to what they need. Everyone has access to food. Everyone knows where the berries and the tubers and the rabbits and the birds and the stuff is. Everyone knows how to build shelter that they need. Every adult knows what herbs serve what purpose medicinally and so on. So when everyone has access to the resources that they need to live, it's very hard to tell anyone what to do or to force them to behave in a way that you want them to behave, because they can very easily say, fuck off. What do I need you for? You're not stopping me from eating or building a shelter or, whatever. Similarly, in foraging societies, everyone's armed, because they're hunters and everyone knows how to shoot. So, okay, you're bigger than me. You can still have a hunting accident. There's no, if somebody gets too big for their britches, hunter-gatherer societies are very adept at putting them in their place. And I talked about this in the book. The first stage is, might be someone might just tell you to calm down. And if you're still getting out of control, someone might make fun of you around the fire, a little ridicule. And if that doesn't work, an elder might speak to you, or a shaman might say, hey, what's going on with you? You're starting to get on people's nerves. But if you hurt someone, you hurt a child, you're violent, hunting accidents happen. You fall off a cliff, you get an arrow in the back, like nobody's ever going to know. So the idea, that Dawkins and Pinker and these people have of the selfish infiltrator, they think that, they do these thought experiments where they say, well, no egalitarian society could last very long because you'd have some shithead like Donald Trump would arise and he'd want to sleep with all the women and he'd want to eat all the food, but he wouldn't want to go hunt because, he's got bone spurs, and he'd end up taking over the society, and his children would have his selfish genes, and then they would, spread because he'd have more children and so on and so forth. Well, this assumes that the society has no immunological response to somebody like this, to a sociopath. Obviously they do. And so when you look at the anthropology, instead of just sitting in your office and at Harvard doing thought experiments, if you actually talk to people who've lived among hunter-gatherers, they tell you, no, someone like that would not last a day. The worst thing you can do in a hunter-gatherer society is hoard food. Your status is based upon your generosity, not upon your selfishness. So the orientation of a hunter-gatherer society is sort of the opposite of what we have in modern Western societies, where accumulation of resources is seen as admirable. In a hunter-gatherer society, dispersing resources is seen as admirable. So again, we can do a thought experiment. If a bunch of, 30 people are in a band level society and it functioned the way these experts claim it would function, I go out hunting, you go out hunting, the other men go out hunting, I shoot a deer, you didn't get one, the other guys didn't get one, I bring it back to the camp, I've got this deer. Okay, well, I'm going to share it with my wife and my kids. And the rest of you, sorry, but, I got to take care of mine, right? So you're all sitting around hungry while we're feasting on this deer that we can't even eat the whole thing anyway. It's probably going to rot. How's that going to work?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense, right? So it doesn't make sense intellectually, but also in terms of the evidence. When you look at anthropology, people in hunter-gatherer groups share food. It's not because they're noble. It's because it's the best way for everyone to survive. We survive as a group. We take care of one another. All of us benefit. We see this in insurance companies in the Western world, even governments. Someone said the government is basically an insurance company with an army, right? It's the idea is it's a mechanism for a society to take care of everybody. And in hunter-gatherer societies that are much more immediate and, as I said earlier, where everyone knows each other, that expresses naturally. It comes out of our nature.
Right.
We are a species that only survive by taking care of one another. So it feels really good. Psychologists will tell you, you're depressed, the best thing you can do is go help somebody, help a stranger. That's the best thing you can do for your own mental health. There's a reason for that.
And you quote the Harvard neuroscience Joshua D. Green, who talks about how morality arises from basic brain activities. It's not handed down by philosophers and clergy, but handed up, an outgrowth of the brain's basic propensities. And I think that's really interesting, that we have this innate sense of wanting things to be equaled and shared. But it also seems like some of us, do have a selfishness, and what makes a community egalitarian does require some effort. You quote someone, archaeologist Robert Kelly, talking about the maintenance of an egalitarian society requires effort. And so I'm interested in that, and I think it's worth kind of trying to help people understand what an egalitarian society among foragers really looks like, because sometimes people are left behind. Sometimes if people misbehave, like you're saying, there's a hunting accident, so there's executions. How are decisions made? How is it egalitarian? It's not like everyone's stopping to vote on everything in emergency. It seems like, we think of a tribe as a form of communalism, but there's also a large degree of individualism in the sense of individual freedom and autonomy. Like you're saying, you can't force someone to do something. I'm curious, how foragers create these societies that are best aligned with the more altruistic sides of us, even though it requires some effort.
Well, again, back to Marvin Harris, right? I think it's organic. I think it grows out of the necessities that they face. So Casilda, my ex-wife and the co-author of Sex at Dawn, I remember her telling me about an expression she heard when she was a kid in Africa, which is, the best place to store extra food is in your friend's stomach. Right? Now, why is that? It could be because they didn't have refrigeration where she lived in Mozambique, right? So where else are you going to store the food? But it could also be because you share food with your friend. Now your friend's going to share food with you. And, sometimes he shoots the deer, sometimes you shoot the deer. So there's a logic to it. The sort of emergence of these behavioral patterns come from the necessities of the environment that you're living in. So, sharing food works better. Now, you might have a kid who says, I want to eat it all. And then the adults will be like, oh, that's not how we do things, right? So there is an encouragement and a discouragement of selfishness, an encouragement of generosity. And it's also their sexual access, right? If you're a man who's a good hunter and you come back and give away all the food, you're going to get laid a lot more than if you're a guy who, eats half the monkey before he even gets back to the village and is stingy about it. That's not admirable. So there's also the sort of, sexual reinforcement of these behaviors.
I'm curious with that specifically with sexuality, because I think that, in an egalitarian tribe, you can imagine how, resources can be shared to an extent, but there are some things that I imagine people want that others have that they don't, like specifically a certain partner. And I'm curious how egalitarian tribes would handle that kind of inequality, that kind of jealousy, that, we can share food, and, a lot of these relationships are monogamous, but, you still are not going to have access to everything that everyone has in the tribe. And how does that fit into the egalitarian scheme?
Immediate return hunter-gathering groups, they don't really have much, right? They have very little in terms of material objects.
Yeah.
So, and most of what they have is just shared. So if there's a pot, everybody doesn't need their own pot, right? We need one pot to cook for everybody. So one of the things that, is kind of amusing is when anthropologists go to try to study these people, an anthropologist will show up with like a trunk, with chocolate bar. I think it was Kenneth Good, I think he wrote a book called Into the Heart about his time with the Yanomami in Venezuela. He was a graduate student, and he shows up with this trunk with, like 20 jars of peanut butter and a bunch of chocolate bars and, pencils and notebooks. And because he was going to be in the jungle for 6 months or something. So he like brought all this stuff. He came one day back to the village. He'd been out somewhere, and all the peanut butter jars were like all over the place and half eaten, and the chocolate bars were all over. And he was so pissed off. Like, they stole all my stuff. These Indians, these crazy. And it wasn't until later that he realized, like, they share everything, right? They don't have a sense of like, this is my thing and that's your thing. They share arrows, they share bows, they share food, so this sense of private property doesn't really apply in these situations. And then as it applies to sexuality, there are, relationships, especially kind of new relationships where there's jealousy and it does sometimes lead to bad feelings and violence and so on. But in Sex at Dawn, we talked a lot about mechanisms in societies to discourage that kind of possessiveness over another person. And they're raising children together too. So there's in most of these groups, paternity is not
it's shared.
It's either shared or it's not understood. So it's not like that's my kid and that's your kid. These are all our kids. We love them all. I don't remember if I quoted this in either of the books, but I remember reading, there was an account of a Jesuit priest who was in Canada. There was a feast happening. He was with a group of native people there, and there was a feast happening. They were eating beavers, and they'd like gone out and invited the people from the nearby villages to come over. We're having a big feast. And this Jesuit priest says to the guy, one of the Indian people there, he says, like, why are you eating all the beavers? Why don't you save them, right? It's snowing. They'll keep. You can. And the native guy says, well, we'll just get more beavers tomorrow. And he says, well, what if you don't? He said, well, we'll be hungry, but we'll get more beavers. There's always more beavers. And then after they ate, people were having sex, right? Like sort of a free-for-all kind of going on. And this Jesuit was, obviously shocked. And he
mortified,
says, to this Indian again, he's like, what are you doing? Why are you letting your women sleep with different men? And he says, well, why not? What's the problem? And he says, well, then, you won't know which children are yours and which are from the other. And the Jesuit, much to his credit, said that the Indian man looked at him with pity. And he said, you people only love your own children. I don't understand it. So what's human nature there? To love all children or just love your children?
Right. Well, so I guess bringing us back around to something we talked about early on, you talk about this idea of a better zoo. Ishmael kind of puts it in terms of escaping from our captivity. You're talking about acknowledging to a certain extent we can't live as hunter-gatherers. We're going to have to be in a certain kind of captivity in a zoo, but it can at least be better suited to our natural environment, one that better aligns with our species. Yet we're talking about how hard it is to affect collective change, that we can really only ride a wave. We can't quite create the wave. But I'm curious, you even say you're hopeful about us, even if the chances are very slim, of recognizing our human nature and creating a society that's better aligned with it. How would you suggest we work towards that future, knowing how hard it is to affect collective change?
Yeah, well, I don't think we can create the waves, but the good news is that there are waves all the time. that we can catch, right? So, and we can learn to recognize them and get ourselves in the right position and paddle into them. As far as how to affect the future or create the future or catch the wave that we want to go in the right direction, we talked about your podcast, the Human Nature Odyssey, right? The Odyssey is the story of Odysseus who goes out, leaves home, has these challenges and adventures and near-death experiences and disasters and learns. And then at the end, he returns back home with experience and knowledge and strength that he's gained and, and wisdom. And then he kills everybody who's trying to fuck his wife. But we can leave that part out.
That's not part of this. That's not part of the Human Nature Odyssey. That's Odysseus' whole thing. Yes.
Let's leave that out.
Yes.
But the nature of an Odyssey is you come back home with what you've learned out there in the world, right?
Exactly.
And it feels to me like, clearly we're at a crisis point. Clearly we, as at least those of us, who are paying attention to, who have the luxury to pay attention to things, see that this is unsustainable, that, the fisheries are collapsing, the ice caps are melting, that, it's just like pick any sort of realm of contemporary civilization, it's collapsing. It's in a state of failure. And so I think, though, that it's also interesting that we have created a global brain. We've created instantaneous communication. We've created a technology that allows you and I to have this conversation for free, and you can push a few buttons and send it out to your audience, and they can share it with other people, and an idea can spread instantaneously around the world. That we've never had that before. That's amazing. And, we can create electricity from sunlight and from wave motion and from geothermal. We've learned all these ways to create energy without spewing carbon into the atmosphere. And we've learned permaculture, and we've learned animal husbandry techniques that are sustainable and that can feed people and aren't cruel to other species. So I feel like we're at this weird moment where these two lines converge. There's the line of the way we've been doing it isn't going to work anymore, but it converges with the line of we've learned enough that now we know there are new, different, better ways to do it. And so I feel like the value of a book like Civilized to Death, hopefully, is that it provides some guidance to say, okay, what do we need as a species to actually be happy and healthy? Like, forget all the propaganda. What do we actually need? What's the scientific basis for this understanding, a more accurate understanding of human nature?
Right. Is it more money? Or is it more community?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so we can tweak our small scale existence in ways that, if enough of us as individuals turn in the right direction, in a direction that makes more sense, maybe the school turns. Right? Like one individual fish isn't going to change the school, but I feel like the cohesion of the school is disrupted. Mm-hmm. There's imbalance in the school of fish right now. It's not functioning as a proper school because people don't believe in the American dream. People don't believe in foreign wars. People don't believe that Wall Street is a good place to invest money. There's conspiracy theories and there's all sorts of stuff going on, but the basic sort of general agreement is broken. And so this is a moment where if enough individual fish say, no, I'm going that direction, everybody's looking for somebody to follow right now. Right. Everybody's looking for something that makes sense. So I feel like it is a moment, a unique moment in human history where if we make decisions that make sense for us on a small scale, it could ripple out and have a large scale effect. So, for example, I was living in LA when I wrote Civilized to Death. Now I live in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere in Colorado where I know almost everybody. The mayor serves coffee at the cafe.
It's pretty cool.
Like my wife works in a garden that this couple's been running for 35 years. We eat food from here. We know the rancher who has the cattle in the valley that have been there since the 1800s, the same herd since the 1800s, and his family's been on this land since then. So, like, I've made personal decisions to try to incorporate as much of this knowledge into my life as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And so people hear me talk. Just 2 days ago, a friend came to visit and bought a house here. We have lots of friends who have moved here. So I think if you do something that inspires people, suddenly your community can come to you, and now you're making real change.
And I think that's a really beautiful articulation of the Margaret Mead quote, honestly.
I was thinking that while I was talking, like, fuck, I'm shooting myself in the foot here.
What's her quote? What's your paraphrase?
Never doubt that a small group of passionate people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. God damn, you just looped me in a circle.
Our Odyssey is complete.
Well done, Alex.
There you have it. Thank you to Christopher Ryan for joining the Odyssey today. There's actually more of this conversation that couldn't fit into one episode. So to hear the rest of the interview, go check out our Patreon. We'll post it 1 week after this episode is released. If you enjoy Human Nature Odyssey, please share it with a friend. This podcast is made in association with the Post Carbon Institute. You can learn more at resilience.org. And as always, our theme music is Celestial Soda Pop by Ray Lynch. You can find the link in our show notes. Talk with you soon.